Welcome to an episode of Hyperlegible that I could not be more excited to be doing. As soon as I read the opening paragraph of Mario Gabriele's four-part series on Founders Fund called No Rivals, I knew that we had to have this conversation. I was hoping that he would be willing to do it, and he was gracious enough to spend about an hour and a half with me talking about the piece. Now, first things first, if you have not read Mario's series on Founders Fund, you might be one of the few people in tech for whom that's true. Go to thegeneralist.substack.com, subscribe, pay for the subscription. It is worth it just for this alone, and there's so much other good content on there. Mario is genuinely one of my favorite writers on the internet, as I tell him in this piece in particular, but just generally when I read some of the stuff that he writes, he's one of the authors that induces the most jealousy in me, and I mean that in the best possible way. There are just things that he writes that I don't read anybody else who writes kind of the same way. Deep into our conversation, Mario quotes Mike Solana of Founders Fund and Pirate Wire's fame as saying that the way to escape competition is through authenticity, which is a line that I love and I think applies so well to Mario's work. In a crowded space of people writing about tech, anytime you read something from Mario, you can just tell that it's his. It's beautiful. So I hope that you enjoyed this conversation as much as I enjoyed having it with him. We talk about everything from how this piece came together to going deep on his writing process and like really in the weeds to even where he decided to put the cutoff point for paid subscriptions, into a bunch of specifics about what he learned studying Founders Fund, the various investors there, some of the investments that they've made, and whether or not the things that they do are copyable or whether it's worth trying to copy anybody else in the first place, or if that misses the whole point of the series. I learned a ton both about writing and about investing from reading his pieces and from this conversation, and I hope you do too. Before we get to our conversation, though, I want to tell you about our sponsor, longtime and only sponsor of Hyperlegible. That's right, ladies and gentlemen, it is Readwise. Now, I normally have a script for this. I tell you about Readwise. The Readwise Reader app is something that I use to save whatever I'm reading, whether it's a Substack essay or if I'm on my Kindle, I highlight things there. All of it goes to the Readwise Reader. I'm trying to use Twitter less and less, and instead of reaching for that X button on my phone, I reach for Readwise and review the things that I've read. It's wonderful. Now, I think anybody who listens to a 90-minute conversation with somebody about the essays that they wrote would love a product like Readwise, and you should go and check it out at readwise.io. But for Hyperlegible listeners in particular, Readwise has a special deal for you. First, you can go try it out for free, but second, at readwise.io/hyperlegible, you can find all of the essays and the conversations about them that we've had on Hyperlegible. So go check it out, support the podcast, support our friends at Readwise, readwise.io/hyperlegible. Now let's get to our conversation with Mario Gabriele. Mario, welcome. Thank you so much for doing this. As I was starting to tell you before we just decided to turn the mics on, there are a few pieces that come out every year that just like fill me with jealousy that one, you got to write the piece, and two, it was written so well. And your Founders Fund series is one of those. So thanks for joining me to talk about it.
Thanks so much for having me. You have filled me with jealousy at many points in my career in a very productive way. So I'm glad I could return the favor a little bit.
Of course. I guess the first question then is just like, how did this happen? How did this all come about? How did you get so much access? Looks like you had their kind of full returns. Tell me the whole story of how this came about.
Okay, so it sort of begins, I guess, start of last year. I sort of was thinking about like, I want to do one of these like really massive pieces and pick a venture firm. And when you start to sort of like think in venture, there's only a few places that you're like, this is going to be a really, really interesting story. And so thankfully, through some folks that had helped on other pieces and like the work, I was able to sort of get in touch with the Founders Fund folks and make a bit of a pitch that, I wanted to write as close to the definitive story as I possibly could. And to do that, I, really couldn't do it without their collaboration. And thankfully, I think, there's now enough body of writing on the Generalist and Not Boring and all these other places that, people can kind of judge what you might do at a reasonable level. And thankfully that was sort of appealing to them. The return stuff, actually came from like lots of different places. I probably shouldn't say exactly how that came to me,
Totally
but
fair.
but yeah, ended up getting to like build that out in a pretty comprehensive way.
It like kind of straddles the line between what we normally do and journalism, where like there's plenty of, all the blemishes are on the page as well in this series. The access that I'm sure they didn't want you to have to their financial returns are kind of all there, but a really kind of honestly told and in-depth story working. Clearly you had a bunch of interviews with the team. How do you strike that balance?
I don't know how you feel about this, but like I think the more that we go through this, the more I feel like I have the confidence or the authority as a writer or a thinker to just be like, I'm just going to say it how as close, like as much as exactly as I think it as possible. And sometimes I think, maybe you have a tendency to try and calibrate one way or another. And I think, yeah, I suppose I'm being remarkably inarticulate here, but I guess I'm just getting more confident in trying to present the story as comprehensively as possible without derailing it, with just one really exciting and dramatic part, sort of taking it in a totally different direction or things like that. So um, I don't think I really did a great job answering you there,
No,
but
no, no. But
it's sort
you
of
did.
how I think about it.
I mean, you tell the story honestly, and then they still end up sharing it and loving it, and it is the story. And you don't want to, I guess, hide the blemishes because then people don't trust the story as well. You mentioned something there because there were a few spots in the piece where I was like, fuck, I would have like definitely overwritten this section, and I would have spent 10 pages going on what you did in a paragraph. How did you get that balance right as you went through? Because there are so many of these little vignettes that you could turn into an essay all their own.
Yes, definitely. I think obviously, you could write a whole book on Palantir and Andrill and like any one of those chapters, frankly. Um, I think as much as possible, I was very generous with myself in the sense that like I definitely stretched the boundaries a bit, but I tried to like narrow in on which parts were actually like most relevant to Founders Fund, the organization, and like use that rough frame as much as I could. And so, for example, one of the things that I didn't mention that I really thought about at certain points was the Peter Thiel Gawker sort of story. And I was like, well, that is a big part of his sort of public narrative. But I sort of started to feel like it had virtually no uh like no narrative payoff in the context of Founders Fund. Like you actually get all this stuff about him being, someone who can keep a grudge for a long time and play the long game with the sort of Sequoia rivalry and the Mike Moritz stuff, and all these other places. And that almost felt like something that would be interesting if you were to really try and force yourself to write the full book of this, perhaps, but actually would just sort of waylay the story in a strange place otherwise. And so maybe that's a good example of like, I mentioned, you have these dramatic things that can sometimes feel like they derail a story a little bit. And maybe I'm getting like a little more comfortable being saying, here's where I'm sort of setting the frame for this. And, everyone will always have an opinion one way or another, but you have to be the one to decide that.
I really liked the format of a 4-part series. I probably would have just written a 40,000 word piece, but like there's also an argument to be made that if you get this kind of access, you just write the book on Founders Fund. I think I learned more per minute, certainly, but just more probably by having it so focused on the important parts, just reading kind of a 40,000 word, 35,000 word 4-part series. Was there ever a temptation to just turn this into a book and do the full thing, or did you know that it was going to be a serialized thing on the generalist?
No, honestly, I actually thought for a long time that it would just be one very, very long piece. And then as it sort of got longer and longer, there was sort of the practical aspect of it, um, and the pragmatic aspect where I was like, man, I've been working on this for so long. I kind of want to be able to not just have it, go out one week and then the next week I still have to produce something new. Like, it's helpful for me if I can build a little bit of that time in. And then also it started to feel like the piece sort of naturally had these chapters that I felt sort of stood reasonably well as standalone chunks. And actually like it ended up, I think, well, certainly the right call, but has given me more confidence in like that structure as something that people will stick around for, because the sort of downside is you think, oh gosh, maybe people are going to really be fatigued by the end. But if the story is interesting enough, I think people look forward to it.
That makes a lot of sense. You shared a graph, I guess, right after the first one of your subscriber count, just kind of shooting straight up thanks to this piece. How did that go over the kind of 4 pieces? Was that, I'm sure that was the biggest spike, but then like kind of what did stretching it out do to subscribers?
Yeah, it was like truly vertical for the first one, and then it obviously kept doing well. But I would say each time it sort of cut in half, more or less.
Yeah.
And so by the end, I think the people who wanted to subscribe had ample chance, and you did have a few people who were like, I was waiting for the last one to subscribe, and so I can read them all. Um, but I think for the most part, like the majority definitely happened sort of straight away.
And you did, I mean, like, I want to get really nitty gritty with you on this because I think you're one of the best at doing it. You did give a lot before the paywall. And then it's like, all right, well, obviously, like you have to hit upgrade here and buy. How much did you think about where to put that cutoff, or was that more of an afterthought?
This is really in the weeds for the Substack folks. I love it.
Yeah.
Honestly, it was mostly about how much you can fit in an email.
Yeah. Okay.
And so it was like a little bit more above that. I did want to try and have like a quite generous amount, just so like people who are on the free list at least sort of get some of the flavor and enjoy it. And also so that, frankly, like people in the Founders Fund diaspora are able to sort of, maybe parts of the story and you want to just sort of dip in or whatever. So we probably could have been maybe a bit more ruthless in that respect, but I think it was, had worked out just fine.
And I want to get to like the actual meat of the stuff first, but this will be the last kind of process question, and I'm going to go very wide on it, which is like, what was the process? It took 18 months. Tell me like just the whole thing, and I'll ask specific questions if needed, but like, how do you go from I want to write about Founders Fund to what you delivered over the past 4 weeks?
It was helped hugely by Aaron Gleason, who's their sort of chief comms person there, who's like truly amazing. I think, you've probably also encountered this. Comms professionals, there's a great variety of what that looks like. And some folks can really try and just like force you to tell one story. And some folks are really sort of trusting of the writer in an exciting way. And Aaron was definitely someone who I feel like just really tried to make it as collaborative as possible and allowed me to tell the story, while obviously still, respecting what her organization could and couldn't share and stuff like that. So that ended up being like a really helpful part of it. But the process was sort of doing a bunch of interviews. And so I think we ended up with, I want to say 12 to 15 roughly. Some people we talked to more than once, a bunch of reading, just sort of reading a bunch of the old books of like that period in tech history that you get pieces from. So you have like Facebook Effect, the Founders, stuff like that, because there's all these.
Yeah, I'm going to go super nitty gritty. Mm-hmm. How much are you reading before the interviews, and how much are you letting the interviews kind of guide what you read? How much is iterative?
Almost all from the interviews, and actually almost all from when I'm starting to write. Like I'll suddenly hit a wall and I'm like, I actually don't understand what happened here.
Yeah.
And then I have to suddenly like read a book as fast as I can. And you sort of pick apart pieces of it and stuff like that. But you'll end up sort of telescopically reading like 10 little books in a tiny period. So there was some of that. Getting the returns data. And then sort of like, listening to a bunch of the podcasts and talks and things like that you sort of just let be ambient information that hopefully shapes your frame of how this person thinks, and maybe the references that you want to start to weave into the piece and give almost the flavor of it in your head rather than like the information.
Totally. And how much are you taking notes during all of it? Are you like a Zettelcast in person? I know podcasts are flavoring, but like, how are you dealing with this corpus of information?
I actually want to like maybe outline all of this at some point, because I used AI as a research assistant in a very different way than I have before. And that was like extremely helpful. And so I used Otter on most of the calls. And then I also do notes as I take them and just sort of pull out the things that I think are especially important. Then I spent a bunch of time sort of doing extra research, adding that to sort of a bit of a structure, and stuff like that. Then what I started to do was create a Claude project, upload all of that stuff into a Claude project, and then also start to do sort of like deep research reports on parts that I felt like I was missing, where I'd be like, this person literally never came up in an interview, but they were there for 5 years. Like, give me this person's life story and I can decide whether it should be in there somewhere. And then just sort of kept adding to it, including the return stuff. And that became extremely useful to do some of the most annoying parts of these big stories, which is like timelines. I don't know if you
Yeah.
find this, but you're like, ugh, okay, technically that was 3 months before this thing. And, all of that wrangling is so tricky.
Yeah.
And this made it like really, really easy. And so that was maybe the biggest shift from a structural perspective.
The writing itself, so you have all of this information. You said you kind of start writing, go back and read to fill in more, but what's that whole process like for you?
It's all sort of energy and atmosphere and like very little structure. Like there's no
Same.
process where you're just sort of like, okay, I'm feeling my way into the introduction. I'm now sort of feeling my way into what should be here and what goes next. And I'm pretty much never a rewriter. Like the first version is always the version that goes out. But while I'm doing that first version, I'm like constantly shifting things. Like I'm like, okay, this section actually should be earlier up or it needs to be expanded and stuff like that. And so it's mostly just, sort of feeling it and then feeling when you hit a wall and being like, all right, how do I get over this?
You said that the chapters kind of naturally emerged, and I agree that they were kind of, the separation worked really, really well. Did you have to reorganize things to get them into those chapters because you ended up going thematically versus just kind of total timeline? Or did you outline that first and then you just kind of knew?
No, yeah, it was just more feeling it out. It's sort of mostly chronological with some thematic chunking, and it just sort of, I don't know, you make these judgment calls where you're like, okay, I'm talking about narrative quite a bit when I talk about 0 to 1. Like, I should probably try and loop in a bunch of the soft power stuff because otherwise it's going to start to feel really strange to come back to this and do this all at once. And so, yeah, I think it just so happened that there were enough things that you could sort of organize it that way while keeping a little bit of a sense of momentum to it.
And did you start with the introduction? Because I want to go deep on the introduction. Did you start there and then just go?
Yeah.
All right. So the opening of part 1 is just so good. You have the scene under the Capitol Dome at Trump's inauguration. How'd you pick that particular scene? The cast of characters obviously was great, but how'd you pick that? And then like specifically, how did you write it? Like, what did it feel like in your head as you were like, oh, like there's a lot of phrases in there that you're just like, that's really good. That's really, really good.
Thank you. I started there because I was just trying to think like Thiel is such a multifaceted person that it feels a bit reductive to I want to start with something that's like an exciting image that reveals basically the whole story in a short period of time and sort of does that framing for the rest of the piece. And if you end up picking just like one investment or something like that, like the Airbnb thing is an amazing chapter, but of their story. I'm not trying to, congratulate myself too hard. But to start with Airbnb feels like, oh man, that misses so much of what this person is and the sort of strangeness of this person's mind and the sort of span of their power. And so I just kept sort of circling it a little bit. And at a certain point, I was like, well, you did have a bunch of these tech CEOs for the inauguration, and obviously you have Vance. So how many of those folks actually were there that like were Thiel connected? And then as soon as you start looking through the photos, you're like, damn, this is actually sort of crazy when you think about it for a minute. How many of these folks maybe actually wouldn't be there if it wasn't for Thiel? Musk probably gets there on Tesla, let's say, but probably SpaceX, maybe doesn't happen or doesn't happen in the same way unless Founders Fund steps in. Zuckerberg ends up there, probably. Vance does not end up there, I don't think. Like, I think, Thiel was like a very decisive presence in him not pursuing a traditional legal career. Sachs probably doesn't end up there. Like, I think you can actually sort of really go through a lot of these powerful people and be like, wow, they are here at least in significant part because this person sort of red-pilled them in a sort of key moment in their life. And so that's just started to feel like a really interesting framing.
And even as you say it, like the fact that Elon probably would have been there, Zuck would have been there, like is a bit of the Founders Fund ethos where it's just like find these superstars and get out of the way and just don't fire them. But then there are these other people that he's kind of slowly developing. So like they're both of those pieces of the story kind of show up there. And you talk about his kind of presence and non-presence because he wasn't actually there. I think he threw a separate kind of party at his house, but he wasn't there. Tell me how you interpreted that. Because there's also like, he's talked about the fact that he's not so happy with Trump anymore. So is it puppet master? Was he just unhappy and so he didn't want to show up? Like, how did you choose to interpret that situation that way?
I think he's probably very conflicted about it. And I think he's, when you see him talk about this over the last year, I think, there was something, where was it? It was some summit where he was like, look, if you put a gun to my head, I vote for Trump. But, that's essentially as ringing an endorsement as he'll give. But ultimately, it's still very much the fruits of his sort of intellectual and political and technical labor that is encapsulated in that segment. I don't think he pulled the strings, but it is definitely a manifestation of him. And so I interpreted his presence and non-presence as like overpowering, even if it's not purely manipulating the pieces. Like they really, he ultimately has done a great deal to make sure that room happened in the way that it did, even if he doesn't like his creation necessarily so much.
And you did actually do the explicit kind of chess thing, moving the different pieces to the different squares, which I thought was brilliantly written. But I like this kind of framing of it that you're giving now. Zooming out a little bit, reading all of this, it almost feels like Thiel and Founders Funds Alpha is like some combination of like actually macro is just like maybe really tough. And you talk about, the macro hedge fund not going well, really tough to apply kind of day-to-day trading, but like actually maybe super underrated in venture. So his macro skill applied to this area where he's like competing against eighth graders essentially on the macro side. And then talent spotting. Like it almost feels like those two things can capture like a ton of his alpha. Do you think I'm missing like a big piece there? Or like how would you split up where Founders Funds Alpha comes from?
I think there's a large chunk of it that is inscrutable even to me after studying it a lot. I'm like, it's just Thiel is running a very specific program in his brain that no one else I've seen runs. There are lots of people who sort of do almost tribute acts to it, but that is the real version. I don't think there's a great deal of explainability around that program in many ways. I think if you were to try and highlight the things, I think you picked the two of the very, very important ones: macro, talent spotting, and then obviously sort of like the anti-mimesis, true contrarianism of just sort of like flip the perceived wisdom and see what something looks like from the other side. And he'll even go as far as to say, he does this at a Cambridge Union talk where he says, if something's a taboo and someone's sort of questioning it, I just sort of as a shortcut automatically believe the questioning of this sort of sacred cow, because presumably you can't question these things if they are so sacred. And so I think that's another part of it where that was sort of relevant for STEM-centrics and some of these other deals. But yeah, I think those are the two big pillars, certainly.
Yeah, I found myself wondering a bunch, and I've never heard it, mimesis or however you just pronounce it, but like the anti-mimesis or the anti-mimetic part of his approach. Like I almost, as I was reading this, wondered if that's really just macro in another name. Like and it's not.
Yeah.
The examples you gave are explicit, but like it is just like you're looking a little bit, you're doing mid-range macro and being like, all right, yeah, obviously everyone thinks this now because they're looking at right now and they're looking at what's available in front of them. It's like almost just chess or like playing a little bit of a longer game and being like, this thing that is a sacred cow right now, like will not be in the future.
Yes, I think that's true. There's definitely, a lot of that. And you see that like very explicitly with some of the thematic waves and how they, sort of played against the field in that way.
Yeah. I mean, avoidance of competition is good. And I just think it's like, to me, and I'd never thought of it this way, but it just like comes across as a signal that like very clearly the thing that is happening now like can't be almost like competition is bad. It erodes margins. And so like, what is that next thing? I'll be on the lookout for that. The other big one is obviously people in the orbit. Like I remember reading, I think it was in the back of The Maniac, where he talks about the story of meeting Demis Hassabis and being kind of the only VC who kind of got him because they were able to talk chess. My favorite example, which didn't show up in the piece, is like even Jesse Michaels, who, you know, is like, has gone from, you know, working with Thiel and Eric Weinstein to being the center of the UAP thing. Like that is not a venture related thing, but he, you know, I think picked him out of Google and had him work at Thiel Capital and bring in scientists. Even finding someone like Jesse who could, like, in a totally unrelated field get to the center of it so quickly is like pretty unbelievable to me, that you can have that kind of talent spotting ability with that amount of range. What do you think that is? Like, distilling all you wrote about people down, maybe it's the program, but like how does he do that?
I don't know. I really wish that I could be a fly on the wall and have watched like the early encounters with Trey Stevens and Thiel, or Mike Solana and Thiel, and Lauren Thiel, Lauren Gross and Thiel, because look, these are such exceptional people, but we're seeing them 20 years after those first meetings, or 10 years after those first meetings. And so you really do wonder, yeah, what were the glimmers in someone that just stood out so much? And the only things that the sort of unifying traits that I've would point to would be, as sort of a standard, like very high intelligence. That's sort of, a given, I think, when we're talking about stuff like this. I think insanely high openness. And sometimes I imagine a lot of that is masked. And I wonder how much he has to dig for that from someone, because would someone like Lauren Gross or Trey Stevens, yeah, probably they would, have some contrarian ideas, but maybe, you don't have the confidence at that phase in your life to really vocalize them. And Solana has talked about that. And then I think like probably this omnivorous curiosity, where these people, in most cases at least, just seem to be truly truth seeking, and looking for the answer to things in all of these like unusual and sort of over the top ways. And it's not the same for everyone. I think someone like Trey is very different, from what I can tell, to someone like Delian or, Joey, et cetera. But they all have some of those maybe shared alleles a little bit. But ultimately, I still don't know. I suspect I could sit in front of these people in Thiel's shoes and maybe miss it.
I think that's been one of the hardest parts of venture for me generally, is my favorite part about the job is that we get to talk to these incredibly smart people who are really passionate about this, like the way that they think the world is going to be and how they can get the world there. And to be able to take that like top 1% or top 0.1% and distill it as much as Thiel is able to, is like, it almost seems like supernatural.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he is the best talent spotter, at least in our sphere of the world, that I've ever seen. There might be others that we don't know about. Maybe some of these CEOs are just unbelievable. But at a certain point, if you're, Bezos or Zuckerberg, you're still looking for outlier talent. But also at a certain point, like you need raw numbers, and so your bar maybe changes a little bit. And so the techniques that someone like Thiel uses to get top 0.1 basis point person maybe look a little different than like top 1% VP style, great hire.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I want to keep going on talent a little bit, but I realize that I'm coming off as like overly, just like amazed by Thiel. And I think like that's probably the right net thing to have. But what do you think he's worst at?
I think he can be an unreliable narrator sometimes. And I don't know if that is like gameplay or he's not aware of it. I don't know. But, things like the Bitcoin summit in 2022, I really still think back on that and I can't figure out what the game he's playing there is, because at that point, Founders Fund has liquidated its crypto position. And so why is he agreeing and giving like the most full-throated endorsement of crypto and saying to everyone, in so many words, saying to everyone like, buy, buy, buy? Like, I think if you want to condense the message of that speech, it's very explicit.
Yeah.
I don't know what the game is there. And so I find him inscrutable in those moments.
It's so funny. I think Elon very clearly has this, where if you're a defender, it's like very easy to say, just like wait 10 years and you'll see that he was right now. And I think Thiel very clearly has some of that same, maybe the game on on Bitcoin is if you're about to come back into the space, you probably wouldn't. I mean, it's not like their investments have been Bitcoin related. Like there's very clearly the Bitcoin crowd and then like the rest of crypto, like trying to build software with the crowd. Yeah, that's a good one. I want to think about that more.
If you figure it out, please let me know, because I really can't figure it out.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I guess we'll see in 10 years. You talk about the law of conservation of talent. Like he finds these people that are exceptional and then sticks with them. But then there's also this, I don't know if it's an explicit rule, but they don't invest often in the Thiel Fellows. And, I think they got to Figma in the Series C and they just filed for IPO. And that would have been, I'm sure they would have had first shot at investing in Dylan's company after the Thiel Fellowship and would have been a fund returner many times over. Why do you think that is?
I think there's probably a few things at work. I think like genuinely, maybe those teams don't talk to each other as much as from the outside we expect they might. And sort of like you don't track those people in the same way. And by the way, I think that's probably true on the other side. Like, I don't know if Dylan, when he was going out to raise, is definitely saying, okay, I should go to Founders Fund first because I'm a Thiel fellow. I think a lot of the time other people recognize this talent and, they maybe in the intervening period are making overtures. And when it comes time to it, actually there are 5 people who are already quite keen to get involved and you like them and you feel no need to go back and alert Founders Fund. I think you're ultimately right that like you would pick, a priori, you would pick Founders Fund position to get those companies first. And so the other part of it that I wonder is just like, if they wanted there to be some degree of separation from like an integrity of the mission perspective where they, can say, we want these people to stand on their own. We want it to not feel like this is Founders Fund sort of boosting a pet project or, overly predating on these talented people. And so I think those are also plausible elements of it.
Yeah. I mean, if that's the case, it's almost more, it's super impressive that you'd be so all in on the mission that, we need to identify this amazing talent and give them a different kind of education. If you explicitly kind of hurt your returns by like not wanting to invest in those folks, are there other spots that you found within Founders Fund or within Thiel generally where like there is a purity thing and a returns thing and they're actually maybe at odds and he chooses the purity thing?
I think he's ultimately a pragmatist. And so I think usually maybe there's an element to it, but I do think he's pragmatic about returns. He clearly believes what he believes very, very strongly, but he's also sort of so intellectually fluid that you can imagine him taking the totally opposite side of something if he found an argument or he, changed his mind. The only thing I would really point to is that they don't give themselves traditionally like a long harvest period on a thesis that pays out. Like, the Facebook example finds Facebook. And the interesting part of that story that I didn't know was that Thiel and Reid Hoffman, who, were both looking at Facebook together, they went into that meeting being like 95% we're going to do it. It doesn't matter what Zuck is like because we believe in this space. And so it was actually like really thesis driven. They also happened to meet like probably the most, maybe next to Elon, the most effective entrepreneur of that generation. And so that made it probably extra easy. But another VC firm would certainly have used that as like an outpost to then snag like the next 10. And arguably Founders Fund should have done that with Snap, WhatsApp, Twitter, et cetera, that came after. You can argue that, by not doing that, they find their next big hits with SpaceX, et cetera. But that is a place where, they're almost so anti-mimetic that they don't, they don't harvest the win to the fullest extent.
That part of the story, I didn't know that either, surprised me that it would be so non-Zuck specific. I mean, I'm sure they looked at Facebook's numbers and it was the hot social media company and clearly going to be the winner. But there were a bunch of other Facebook-like companies at that very time. So to like be thesis driven and make that investment without having it be a Zuck specific thing. Maybe it was just that they had looked at the numbers before and they're like, this is clearly the winner here.
Yeah, maybe like traction, the sort of motion across the college campuses and stuff like that they were maybe just like, this looks great. This looks like the version we've been waiting for. And then, probably makes it extra easy when you get into the room.
Trey wrote something that I'm going to mess up the name on that was something like venture for sheep or whatever, where it really does explicitly talk about this Founders Fund idea that the winner in the category is just always so much bigger than the next. And he talks about Facebook, and he talks about Uber, and he talks about SpaceX, that if you really think that you've identified that winner, it does make sense to actually just skip to the next thing and try to identify the winner. Now, they have a portfolio with more than like 5 companies in it, so maybe you could harvest a little bit. But I do think that seems like a belief that runs fairly deep there.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, you probably can't get one without the other. Like, I think there is probably a version where if you let that settle in too deeply into an organization, maybe you start to get sort of a little safe, a little satisfied with, being the social guys and being like, we're just going to, pick a few other great things. And I think the sort of almost relentlessness they give themselves of like, all right, we really have to figure out the next thing because, this is done is part of what makes the organization like really effective.
Do you think that Founders Fund could survive without Peter at this point? And survive is maybe the wrong word, but like could be Founders Fund without Peter at this point, having built all of this up?
No, I don't think so. I think they'd probably still like be very good and still a tier 1. But do I think like they would be as dominant as they have for the past couple of decades? Probably not. I think he, as a talent picker and as a macro person, like he is setting so much of what to look for in some way. And Lauren Gross talks about this, that like once a year, Peter has some big macro thing almost where he's like, this way, look for consumer over 1 billion, and that's how you get Airbnb and stuff like that. And so I think that's probably true of like almost any good venture firm is if you take out the one best person, like venture is such a top heavy game, right? It's like, yeah, if you take out the best VC from every firm, it would be a nightmare versus taking out like, 10 of the middling people, you'd have I suspect almost no difference. And so, yeah, they're the same as everyone in that respect. But I think because Peter is so, such a special brain, like maybe they would feel that a bit more.
Is there any sense of succession planning that you picked up talking about Founders Fund?
No, I sort of mentioned it a few different times. I think the reality is like, I almost get the sense they don't think about it in that way. I think Peter, wants to do this for as long as sort of he can.
Which might be forever, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. He's putting in place the steps to make sure it's forever. And I think, there's a chance that maybe when he steps down, they sort of wind things up. I don't get the sense that they're like necessarily as keen on the idea of like, we must pass this from generation to generation. I almost get the sense that they're like, we want to be the best team on the field. And when that no longer is like the mission, like that's okay. So I don't know. I suspect it will outlast him, but I would put the odds sort of lower than a lot of other shops where that succession planning is like, front of mind almost.
The returns.
What do you think, actually?
It was like one of the big open questions after reading the piece. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, you talk about the fact that he wants to apply kind of the spotlight to wherever he thinks the best opportunities are. That a decade ago he said the next decade's going to be all about venture, and so this is kind of playing that out. He's seeing probably further into the future than I am. Like it still seems like venture and its related kind of growing orbit of asset classes is going to be pretty good for a while. But yeah, maybe that change. Like maybe it really is like we see this opportunity and we're going to harvest this thing, to the greatest extent possible. And oh, by the way, like if we make SpaceX happen and these other companies happen, like we probably help the good future and maybe help avoid the Antichrist. Although I thought that was like a funny part of the Ross Douthat exchange was him, grappling with investing in AI. I actually thought that one. Did you watch the Ross Douthat interview or listen to it? Or
when did that come out?
It was this Sunday, I think, or this weekend.
Oh, no, I didn't.
Last week, maybe in the New York Times. And so like it's a lot of the greatest hits from his conversations, like the Antichrist, like too much centralization of power because of AI. But Ross kind of pushes him a little bit on the idea that like he's like, well, aren't you like investing in
Quite
AI?
a lot
like,
in OpenAI.
Yeah, don't you have a lot in OpenAI? And you wrote this like amazing section. I started writing an essay on like something related and was gonna quote it and didn't end up writing this particular essay. But you wrote about the fact that Peter Thiel is willing to kind of carry a thought to its logical conclusion, no matter how uncomfortable that is, more than anybody else. And in that conversation, I think he almost, I got the sense that he doesn't think that like we're going to get a super fast takeoff where AI solves everything. And that seems fairly clear. But there is almost this, like, he's worried about stagnation and us waiting. And he was like, I'd rather have AI than not have AI, but like, it's a bummer that AI is like really the only thing that we're very excited about right now. And I wonder if there's almost a, like, by waiting or like hoping that AI will be this thing that solves everything. Like, it felt like that's where he was going and why he didn't feel like the Antichrist. Like, the actual bad thing is not that AI will centralize everything, but that it'll keep us waiting on all this other stuff. Like, maybe AI cures dementia, or maybe AI builds the rocket factory, or like comes up with the next, like, the new rocket that actually does enable interstellar travel. And so we just wait and stagnate in that whole process. But he didn't say that. And it felt weird, having just read your piece about him carrying it all the way through, that he kind of like let that one just hang out there.
Oh, interesting. All right, I have to listen to it. The last one that I remember listening to was the sort of Jordan Peterson interview, and I was like, okay, this actually felt more like a redux of things that you're like, yep, I know Thiel, thinks these things. And I felt what was really lacking in that conversation was a discussion of AI. So this sounds like, yeah, right up my alley. I'd be very interested to hear how they reason through it. There's some stuff around the AGM they had in 2023, which gives a little bit of a structure to how he thinks about AI, but not to this sort of more philosophical extent.
That was actually one of the more jarring things in the whole series to me, was how bland those slides were. Like, it was, it's 2023, so like maybe they're a little earlier to saying kind of what other people are saying, but it's like, it was the most like milquetoast way of talking about what AI might be. It's like, does it help, replace work or whatever? There were these like three very bland buckets. Was that jarring to you at all? Like, it seemed like very like unfounders fund almost.
No, because I still think what I liked about it was at that point, they were definitely not getting carried away by AI. And I think like actually maybe the more disappointing thing would be like if they were like, AI is going to change everything. And actually, in some of the other slides that maybe I didn't, I didn't have the ability to share, that were more off the record, but you see them sort of taking more of the pot shots, and I think I was able to talk about it, but just not, give the screenshot, and talking about things like Jasper and inflection, and they were sort of, a little more combative than as you would expect. So, but still, I think your point is a good one, which is that like there wasn't some crazy revelation about like, okay, here's the real play behind it, and maybe that's what we sort of needed. We need another of these catchphrases of like the 140 characters thing for this generation that's going to prime talent towards the most interesting problems, because I cannot help now but see so much of what is coming out as like pure mimesis. And it's actually like, it's actually sort of hard not to get almost too carried away with it from that perspective now. But yeah, that has been an influence on how I think about it.
We do need one of those clips, because it's been the thing that's kind of brainwormed to me recently, is that like maybe a lot of it, and like there's different types of AI. I think with stuff happening in bio is like super fascinating, like astrophysics and weather, like taking these like massive data sets that like we couldn't do anything with before and like actually turning them into tractable and solvable problems is like super, super cool. Chat to me, while amazing and like while it helps write this process, like does feel a little like social media that makes you feel smart in terms of its ability to like distract you and have you like pull you away from other things. And so we do need 140 characters.
Yeah, like we need to have a good way of sort of a new narrative that allows us to recognize which parts of this are actually like extremely trivial and not worth working on versus like really, really important. And I don't think actually we have like a good structure for that at the moment. And that's why, I have the habit of checking Product Hunt every day, just because I love to adopt new products. I love to try new things. I'm a sucker for some new like note-taking tool that I imagine this time it'll be perfect. And it is just crazy the extent to which you see the same idea repeated literally almost on a daily basis. And so, how do we get sort of stop that from happening?
And I think one of the anti-competition lessons is like, to me, even if it's the great, like if you've stumbled on the greatest idea in the history of the whole entire world and 30 people do it, then it is no longer a good business, most likely.
Yeah.
They've stumbled on a bunch of businesses that are, how's this for a transition, that are exceptional and haven't faced competition. And as a result, the returns have been spectacular. Can you just like walk us through their performance over time in whatever way you think kind of best illustrates that?
The biggest thing for me is just both in terms of peak and consistency, it's truly nuts. I mean, they have 3 of the best VC funds that I've ever seen at like a really like chunky size. Like to have a 15x on 625 million is pretty amazing. And it seems like they've just managed to keep that up at an extremely fast pace, or at extremely consistent pace. And then you have a bunch of like, I don't know, insane individual bets. The SpaceX one is obviously particularly nuts to have fair market value and realized proceeds on a $670 million investment be 18 billion, with a very good chance of that, you know, continuing to go up.
I haven't talked to a single investor who underwrites it at anything less than $1 trillion. So that
really
will go up. Yeah.
Wow, that's bananas. So there you go. Like that already. I mean, that might be is that the best venture bet of all time? Not on a multiple basis, obviously, but you know, yeah, exactly. Got to be up there. And then you have Anduril. Anduril's obviously a story that's, you know, you can totally see that 10xing even from here and maybe beyond.
Inshallah.
So there's exactly. There's just so many of these things that you can point to.
If Saudi Public Investment Fund came to you today and said, I need you, just like, here's unlimited money. I need you to start a fund that competes with Founders Fund. I know competition's for losers, but you have to compete with them and you have to win. What would you do?
I would say no, thank you. I definitely don't want money from the PIF. Like there's multiple layers to that. Like 1, I would not want to compete with Founders Fund head on, but 2, I would be like, no shot. I do not like the current rapprochement, except as like pure game theory. And I understand there's, you know, real pragmatic reasons why it matters. But like for me as an individual who makes no impact on global politics, I feel very comfortable saying, hell no.
All right. Sorry. Yale comes to you and they says, we just liquidated a bunch of our positions.
I prefer the Saudis. No, I'm just kidding.
Bigger question, like if someone were crazy enough to like actually really want to compete and win, like in this style of investing, like are there chinks in the armor? Are there weak spots? Are there like things that you would do to counter position against Founders Fund to actually try to win?
Well, you can always do it with a very, very, very prominent person, right? Like I think if Patrick Collison decided he wanted to do a fund today, maybe Sam Altman. I mean, I guess he sort of does it in a few different ways, but if they decided that was like their next big mission, like the Collisons were like, hey, we're going to dominate, I think they would take deal share off of everyone, right? They would take deals off of everyone because they're just that smart, that well-respected, that connected. And so I think it has to be someone of that altitude to make an immediate impact. If you're playing a longer game, I think you have to just make the bet that you are picking spaces very different from them and not trying to compete head on. Like I don't. I mean, you can do it. I guess Andreessen's doing it, and seemingly, I think, doing it like effectively. But I wouldn't feel good as a new big fund saying, you know, I'm going right head to head with them on deep tech and defense, because you are definitely getting adverse selection on all of those. And so, unless you have some very unusual insight, I think it's unlikely that you outperform them. You might still do well, but I don't think you surpass them.
I mean, you have a list of commandments, which I love, that just kind of show up as these blocks throughout the series. I'll just run through them all. Insiders undervalue breakup startups. 2, back the founders religiously. 3, mimesis rules everything around us. 4, the law of talent conservation. 5, the world does not need more apps. 6, move away from heat. 7, invert, always invert. 8, make variance your friend. 9, pro rata is lazy thinking. 10, a college degree is a faulty credential. 11, find cerebral gladiators. And 12, hire talent, not experience. I was going to ask you to like kind of go through a couple of them, and maybe we will, but to your point there, like You do see a lot of funds like aping one piece of what Founders Fund does, or like trying to be controversial, or like, oh, we do deep tech now, or all of that. Like, do you think trying to imitate Founders Fund is done like pretty well? Net positive for a fund or net negative for a fund? Like, if you can't reproduce the whole thing, do you think trying to do pieces is good or bad?
Versus like median or versus top quartile, top decile? Like, I think it's
Yeah, I
very
mean,
hard.
median's not super hard, but like, I don't know. Like, do you think like Founders Fund? I think one interesting example is they did SpaceX, and
Yep.
this is the Trey piece. They did SpaceX, and so now people are investing in like the other space companies, or they did defense, and people are like, or they did Anduril, and so people are like, hell yeah, we're going to invest in like this other defense company, and that's like the clearest example to me of like you almost limit yourself on returns by following exactly what they're doing.
Yeah.
Or following kind of like the, on the page what they're doing without the whole kind of thing. And I wonder, just like, if other venture firms are reading your series, should they be trying to take lessons and say like, oh, I'm going to take this particular thing that Founders Fund does? Or do you think like trying to imitate any one of the pieces actually leads to like maybe worse outcomes versus where you are now?
I think you can learn from all of these great firms and great organizations, and hopefully, if there are venture people listening and they're sort of intrigued by it, there will be useful food for thought. But I do think it's fundamentally uncopyable in some way. Like, there's just a level of originality that even if you now tried to do exactly everything you see in the piece, you're still not gonna have the context, the depth, the originality to then grab the next thing. And so I think you're much better off trying to figure out your specific game and how that compares to, the talent you have and so on and so forth, than trying to replicate this. I think I don't think this quote maybe made it into the piece, but maybe it did. Mike Solana had a great quote where he talked about the way to escape competition is through authenticity. And I actually think that was like very profound on a number of different levels. It obviously applies to the venture context, but also to what we do, to, what almost everyone does. And so, in fact, when I asked almost everyone at the fund sort of what their big lesson from Peter was, it was like, you just have to get you like focus on your comparative advantage at the expense of everything else. And that's another way of saying that, in a sense. And so if I was to take one lesson from the piece as a fund manager, it would be like, find that comparative advantage and then design the game so that you can like just do that.
Yeah, I think that is amazing advice. Zooming in on Solana, I think another area where Founders Fund has impressed me is that a lot of different venture firms, big and small, have tried to build media arms. And so like, obviously we're in the middle of this. And like, every time you see an announcement, you're like, hey, is that going to like, are people going to start reading that? And inevitably, like, mostly they don't. And mostly venture firms don't do a very good job of creating content for a whole bunch of reasons. I think like one is like inauthentic, two is like you're almost constrained in what you can say as a venture. Like, another venture firm certainly couldn't have written this piece, for example, but there are lesser examples. And the one example that I always point to is Founders Fund, right? Like, Pirate Wire is separate from Founders Fund, but of Founders Fund. Coogan on YouTube, when he was doing these great documentaries while he was in residence at Founders Fund, and now obviously doing TBPN. What do you think it is that they get right on the narrative side that other firms like can't seem to get?
I think it's just they have really original polarizing ideas and they are not afraid to share them. So I think there are lots of folks probably who have similarly polarizing ideas or interesting ideas. I think they're certainly on the right curve of it, but let's say, there are others. But for various reasons, people don't feel comfortable sharing them. And often I think that's because of the environment of the firm, where if they did share them, there would be a talk with HR, there would be, social pressure from folks. And Founders Fund story is like antithetical to that because of who Peter is. And so they're actually like selecting in a way for you being, willing to do that and willing to put your opinions out into the wild. And I think, most venture firms don't want that attention. And so is part of the problem with the media angle is that you get a very milquetoast version of things that that doesn't really express a point of view. And if it is, it's sort of balmy optimism, which is not a beautiful dramatic palette. And so that is like a big advantage in the narrative world. Like if you're competing against, I'm thrilled to announce, you with really spicy takes, like that's a pretty easy trade.
Yeah. It's interesting too, because like Coogan's documentaries were under his own brand, and they were kind of more just like, here's about the company. Pirate Wires is interesting because like if you're Founders Fund and you're the original founder friendly firm, one of the things that I think really ties people's hands, or funds hands in particular, is you've made an investment in the category that you realize sucks. And like you can't go full throated, talk shit on that category because you have that investment and you're friends with the founder. It's not like even a money thing. It's just like you don't want to talk shit on this thing that, it's just awkward. And Pirate Wires has just started shitting on like, when it shits. And it also has some of the most constructive and like beautiful stuff too, and have people in industry writing. But when it shits, it's on things that are like outside of what a startup might do. And so you get the bad boy kind of flair on that side. And then it almost lends credibility to when you say good things about things on the other side.
I like that we should just keep trying to say when it shits and when it shits. Yeah, no, that's, I think that's true. But I also think, by the way, like Delian will shit on crypto and they have Joey, and so on and so forth. And so I think they're just kind of like, yeah, everyone's allowed to have their opinion. If that sort of scares you as a crypto founder, like you're probably not for us anyway. Like, you should be comfortable with the fact that there's going to be a lot of criticism of your industry. We also happen to have someone who's like a true believer and a very, very brilliant crypto investor. But don't expect everyone on the team to sort of like suck up to you all the time.
It's pretty nice. Speaking of Delian, what does Founders Fund get right about, and we'll put them in quotes, but incubations that other firms haven't?
I think they just really try not to do them. And then when they do them, they basically treat it like a new company that they just happen to be involved in. And so I think there's no pressure in the organization to create something new, right? Like I think a lot of the time venture incubations happen where we're like, we're going to create 2 new companies a year, and that's going to be fantastic because we're going to get these great opportunities. And the result is that you end up just like grabbing for ideas too much. You try and like create too much of a factory style model. You're like, which parts of our process are replicable? Whereas I think Founders Fund really comes at it, with that macro view from Peter and others, where they say, okay, this is going to be a really important thing, we think, over the next 50 years. And it's going to start getting important in the next, let's say 5 years. So someone needs to do this. And then they really look for it and learn about it in such a deep way. And at least the impression I get is that they would vastly prefer to fund someone than found it. I think if Trey had found a decent, modern defense prime, he would have very happily backed it. And it's probably better that it happened this way, but still, I think the lack of pressure in the system to do that just leads to a much more organic founding process that's much more similar to how other companies get formed.
There's also something that comes through to it, which is like, if you build a wider organization that is all about just attracting like the very best people that you can in the world, like maybe they'll be great investors, but they're probably going to be great at a whole bunch of other stuff. I wonder what writing this series has done to your opinion, and I don't even know, like it's not the great man of history theory, but like just the opinion of how much more capable some people are than others.
I don't know if it's changed it hugely, to be honest. I think if you're interested in technology, you pretty quickly realize that there are some people that just have a certain set of abilities that allow them to be insanely productive in this industry and do much, much more, not even 10 or 100. It's like, on the orders of 1,000 plus times more than someone else. And that's like really hard to wrap your mind around, I think, from outside of tech, actually. But you see it everywhere, right? Like ultimately genius, you can totally see that in writing. There are people who just have abilities that are hard to fathom, and art and things like that. So if anything, maybe Founders Fund made me a little bit less religious on the importance of the founder, which is a strange lesson to take. But I do think there's something really interesting about the fact that some of their biggest wins have come from observing the macro first rather than meeting an amazing person first. They then do find amazing people to meet that opportunity. But I suppose, to put a finer point on it, um, I'm less religious about the idea that a founder has to be the one to lead you to the next great opportunity. It's possible that someone else has to lead that founder there. And that could be Alex Karp, following Peter to start Palantir. That could be Trey bringing, Palmer, Matt, everyone else to the opportunity at Anduril. It could be, what's happening at Varda. But actually, it's not necessarily the case that this great entrepreneur has to have found it themselves and definitely knows where the future is first.
That is so interesting, because I think there, and I've written about this a little bit before, but there's this like circular thing when you're evaluating a founder, which is like, is it the founder or the idea? And like a really good founder will have found an idea worth working on and a really good idea. And then like, how do you, I guess it comes down to like, then how you evaluate the founder. These incubation cases are particularly interesting there, but I wonder if it's just a matter of, I think one of the things that I feel luckiest about in this job is you just get to talk to people who are highly capable and who have like zoomed in on one thing that they believe and then like done a ton of research. So if I'm writing about a company or something happening and I get to talk to a founder who's just like dedicated the last 2 years to thinking only about this thing with this exceptional brain, like you just learn so much and it distills so much so quickly. But I guess if you had a brain that was clocking at like 10 times higher speeds than that, you could find some of those same things and get to the same level of depth without having had to spend all of your life on that particular pursuit. And I wonder if like something like that is happening here.
Yeah, I think that's possible. I think with someone like Peter, that seems to be the case, and almost comes at it less. I mean, he's obviously extremely well read, but sort of less from a deep research perspective and more from this, zeitgeist interpreter vibe, where he's like, these are the winds sweeping across our world, and that means X needs to exist. Now, I don't think many people can do that, but clearly there are a couple, I guess, who are able to sort of spot that enough and be convincing enough to get someone really amazing to sort of carry it forward.
This is not even good interview. I'm just like thinking through this with you, because then there's like the counterpoint, which is fun, that in each of these examples, like I don't think it didn't. Certainly, I know that Peter didn't tell Delian go make a space manufacturing company. Didn't tell Trey go make a defense prime. Doesn't sound like he told Scott to go make a nuclear fuel company. So like,
yeah, you're
that
right.
is true. Right. And then so all these examples come bottom up.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I don't know. I think those ones are maybe more about research and sort of like. But still, that's not entirely satisfying, because I don't think that's true either. It's partially true. I don't know. I think there's maybe some aspect where when you're at the firm long enough, you start to also learn about these things that are just massive opportunities, and you're with people who have done it or are doing it, and maybe you start to pick one to take a bite out of.
Yeah, and there's probably also, like, if you look at each one of these things, I think in a lot of these like hard tech categories, the important thing to find is like, what's the bottleneck? So like, there's a bunch of stuff that you could do in nuclear. It's like pretty clear that fuel is actually the bottleneck to all of those things. Or Delian is almost like permission to take a longer view on this thing, where it's like, we want the space economy, but it can't just be this government funded thing. So like, they all have kind of Thiel undertones to like the long range thinking, and then the specific bottleneck is something that then you can like kind of hone in and identify. I wonder if there's something there, and there's probably like 90% of it is ineffable and we're not going to be able to figure out in a conversation.
It may also be just much simpler than we think, which is like lots of VCs have theses about things. Founders Fund just happens to have theses about like very, very massive civilization or at least national scale problems that no one else seems to want to take on, versus being like, I have a really interesting neobank wedge. And so that ends up lending itself to being like, hey, we should probably just spin this up and give it a shot. And like, obviously there's a lot of intelligence that goes into it, but I also think it could just be that.
Is there one investment out of all of them? And you talk about Airbnb a bunch, and so if you want to go deep on that one, but one investment that you've covered of founders funds that you think like really illustrates how the whole machine works as well as any of the others?
I think Airbnb is probably like the canonical sort of synecdoche investment that shows the rest. Even though, well, actually probably because it is, it is a 140 character investment. And so, there's something nice about the fact that it doesn't feel like a founders fund investment, but also very much is a founders fund investment, because they do make lots of these good software bets. And I think that one, was one that Lauren Gross pointed to as sort of a symbolically sound investment, because it starts with a macro call from Peter saying, hey, after everyone got so hyped about Facebook, now everyone's gone the other direction where consumers oversold. And so we should start looking in consumer, and specifically sort of later stage consumer. So everyone start keeping an eye out for, $1 billion plus consumer plays, and let's find a really good one to do this year. And so you have the macro play. Then you have Napoleon Ta, who had just joined that summer, who is sort of regarded as a real quantitative genius, doing like very deep data analysis on all of these different companies across different consumer spaces, and sort of honing in on Airbnb as the one that was poised for a breakout, where he was seeing, in all of these markets that they're in, they have a really small share, but it's growing super fast. Like, there could be something here. And so all of that coalesces in them then making like a hyper concentrated later stage investment. I think it's like would have been 20% of their fund or something wild like that, maybe more. They spread it out across a couple funds, but really just like, high risk investment, and insane payoff. And so that was a good example of an opportunity that was in front of lots and lots of people if they'd had their eyes open to the possibility of it. But by going against the herd, by doing the work, and then by leaning in this massive way, they created this crazy outcome.
That's a great example. And then I'm going to do one more of these kind of general questions, which is, of all the characters that you've encountered covering Founders Fund, a favorite character might be a tough one to answer, although if you want to answer that, that's great. But like, who is the one that surprised you, or maybe represents the firm well enough? Like, who's a person that you want to talk more about that you wrote about in the piece?
Napoleon. I mean, Napoleon is also the most mysterious, and I got to hear some things and know some things that were off the record, and he is a very fascinating character from everything I learned, and extremely good, and truly allergic to the limelight in a way that is not super common in our industry. And so I think there's almost zero chance that someone will get to do the comprehensive story on Napoleon, but I hope it happens someday. It doesn't have to be me, but I suspect there's a wonderful piece to be written there that I hope someone would pull off. But from everything I've heard, it could take 30 years to convince him to do that. So I don't know. I don't know who will do it.
Maybe that's why he's so good. It's so funny too. I mean, like, contrarianism is so overused in relation to Founders Fund, but like, it's pretty almost like canonical rule in venture that like spreadsheet investors are like not the best investors. And then he sounds like is just the greatest. I think they actually just had the Excel World Championships, and it sounds like were he to compete, he would probably do fairly well.
Yes,
in that.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
It's. I still don't, because he's so mysterious. I still don't really understand what makes him so good. Like, I think I say this in the piece, but like, you really don't need to be that quantitatively brilliant to do growth investing modeling. Like, to be clear, I've never learned it. I don't know how to do it, but there are lots of people who do this, right? And so what is it that he sees in a spreadsheet that someone else doesn't, that in, someone who's done 10 years of IB doesn't? Like, I just don't understand. But clearly he has the deep respect of Peter, and has been behind, a really impressive string of growth investments beyond Airbnb that speak to something very, very impressive there. And so I wish I could figure out more. I also think that Joey Krug is like a really compelling character, and if one of the sort of moves I could see over the next few years for Founders Fund is them just doing a bunch more crypto than they have historically, and that doing really well.
And I've really liked their crypto investments so far.
Totally.
I mean, they went long Polymarket kind of right before it broke out.
Yes.
And just like, and then all the headlines are like Peter Thiel backed Polymarket like breaks out. But that was a good bet to make at a really interesting time that feels a little macro-y and a little specific. And Joey had experience,
totally.
doing prediction markets. And so that feels like another one where it all kind of came together fairly perfectly. We'll see how it plays out. But I thought that one was fascinating that they came in and just like, that might have been, was that Joey's first crypto investment at the fund?
I don't know if that one or Igloo, the Pudgy Penguins company, came first, but I think that was like 1 and 2 basically.
Which is like the exact opposite
Yeah, exactly.
crypto bet.
Right.
And it was literally my bodega this morning, and my little shitty bodega has the Pudgy Penguins trading cards on the
way.
on the counter.
Wow, it's become that widespread.
That one shocked me because I know it's in like big box and all of that, but it shocked me that it was it's the only thing on the counter in the bodega, and they couldn't be. I mean, you could probably do some like ZKP infrastructure stuff that's more opposite Igloo, but for consumer facing stuff, Polymarket and Igloo are like the opposite ends of the spectrum, and for those to be the first two is just really interesting.
Yeah, 100%. So I bet they're going to make some. Yeah, I suspect they'll be really, really good at that. I mean, obviously they've been very good at the liquid crypto stuff, but mostly didn't do any of the other stuff.
Do you think their reentrance into crypto means just buy?
I think 100% Packy.
Is this financial advice?
Yes, this is all fine. No. I don't know. I don't know how to answer that. I think it will be interesting though.
So at the very end of the series, as we're winding down here, you highlight attention, and I'm just going to read it because I thought it was beautifully written. And if you had published a little earlier, this is the quote that I wanted to include in my essay yesterday. But you said, quote, "It is not easy to remain original and successful. The world moves on around you. It takes your best ideas and digests them. The world eats all of this, swallows it whole, and asks, what now?" And there are some other examples that you have in there. And now you've contributed in part to making Founders Fund more legible. You lay out the commandments. Having spent all this time with the firm, do you think that they'll be able to kind of resolve this tension and remain original and successful?
I suspect yes, but it's not like totally clear to me in the sense that you can't see at this point the next act very obviously. You still see them mostly, if I had to project, I'll be like, over the next 3 or 4 years, I suspect they'll still keep doing a lot of this defense stuff, a lot of, deep tech stuff. They'll do other things too, but that seems, maybe some of this industrial stuff, Crusoe, General Matter.
Yeah.
But it's not obvious to me what the next thing is. But Founders Fund's genius is usually that you don't see it coming until they already snagged the biggest winner. So I think the only things that you would think might impede them are the fact that it is very hard to come up with constantly new, interesting ideas. Like, usually, and you look at the history of like great thinkers even, often they had kind of one massive, amazing idea, maybe 2 or 3. And so is applying an anti-mimetic lens to venture Thiel's like, genius idea, and can that keep giving indefinitely? I don't know. Maybe it can, but it's a wide enough lens that you think it could. But anyway, all to say, in a very roundabout way, they have an insanely talented team. I think what looks to me like the best team in venture, and as long as that's there, you'd want the chance to be an LP in it. Let's say.
I think plenty of people want. How oversubscribed have their funds been?
Gosh, I don't know. I actually don't know. I know the last one they wanted to raise 3, I think, and it ended up being 4.6. But I imagine people are cutting off fingers and toes to get a little taste. But yeah, it would be the one that if I had the ability to get in, it would certainly be one I would fight for. Let's say. But I don't know what the next chapter is. I really don't.
Your point on being able to find that next big idea or like the next thing that is anti-mimetic is so interesting. It's where I go when I think about this too, as I was preparing for this interview. And then of course, like the counter to that is that my brain just can't figure out what's next, but maybe others can. But it does, unlike, say you're a physicist and Einstein has the whole universe to mine for ideas. And it's like these physical laws that we just need to uncover. Like this has to be, it can't just be a good idea. It has to be a good idea because the world has changed in such a way. And like, maybe we are like, there are just 2 decades of kind of reaping what we've sowed on this particular set of ideas. And it will take a long time to transform these really big industries. And so like, you can have the craziest, most wonderful idea that you want, but like, if the companies and opportunities aren't there, then what do you do with that kind of original thinking?
Yes, I think, it'll be. Do you have any thoughts on where you're like, I don't know, maybe they'll do a bunch of biotech?
It is exactly the category that I was thinking.
Yeah.
I I am a bad biotech investor who's gotten to work with Elliot Hirschberg, who's I think is a very good biotech investor. And I'm almost a believer that like mispricings don't like really happen, but like if anything is mispriced right now, I think it's bio. Like the market has just been like the venture market has been really tough in bio compared to all of the progress that we're seeing in bio. Um, that to me seems like the very obvious area where they would kind of start investing more heavily, because it's a bunch of bio-specific firms who maybe rightly or wrongly, but I think like it is just a more conservative group of people. If there was like a group to compete with, I think that would potentially be one of them. It's why I'm so bullish on Elliot, is because I think he's really good at both being a scientist and thinking big, but also taking advantage of the valuations that they have in that category. Bio is the one that came to my mind. They already have their big BCI bet. I was going to say like just brain stuff. Generally, they have Neuralink, but I think bio would be an area that I would not be surprised to see them play a little bit more.
Yeah, that would be really interesting. I wouldn't be surprised also if we just see more of the energy stuff. That's like feels more of a piece with some of the other stuff in the industrial world, but maybe that becomes a bigger focus. I don't know.
Yeah, and do they need to be original to be successful at this point, or is the brand just so strong that like actually competition's for losers when you can't win, but if you can win every time, competition's just fine?
I don't think it works because they're competing literally for top spot, and so if they skip a beat, then Sequoia is getting is winning those deals, or maybe Kleiner or Thrive or whoever else, and so I think they will not be satisfied unless they remain number one. I don't think being like top five would feel like success to those people. They could, I think they could almost, do very little and remain, a great brand and still probably maybe get 3x returns or 5x returns on a fund. But I think, I don't think that's the game they want to play. So I don't think they could do what they're doing now without that originality.
I think that's a good place to end on Founders Fund. Just for you, what has drawn you? I think it's pretty safe to say that you become like the best in the world at writing about venture funds. What drew you to them, or like what draws you to venture funds? And is there one that you want to do next? I think I know what it would be, but
I want to hear your guess for sure. But
yeah.
Venture funds are interesting to me because the product is the same. The product's just money. And so it all becomes about strategy and personalities. And so you're sort of in a way, obviously not all money's the same. Some people have more or less, et cetera. But in a way, it's like a very clean playing field where you can see like, okay, what is the game that each individual person is playing? And by simplifying that part of the process, the strategy becomes like extra clear to me. And so I like that vantage. And then honestly, like a good chunk of it is I like to learn about this. Like we're both venture investing. And so I find that I pick up really useful things from doing these deep dives that lots of people in our industry who have worked in venture for a super long time might not have had the chance to learn it or the inclination to learn it. And to me, that feels like free, not free alpha, but just like at least raising my floor by a decent amount. And so there's sort of a productive element and a more aesthetic part of it.
Okay, so before you answer the particular firm question, what in all of your learning about Founders Fund do you think has raised your floor the most?
The commitment to moving away from heat. Like I think there's probably like you can very much hear the opposite advice in venture, right? Like I feel like this was maybe an Andreessen thing during the 2021-2 cycle of like, instead of running away from the hot spaces, you should run towards them because usually that means there's something really powerful there. And it's all about winning rather than, finding the unseen opportunity. And that is a way that you can do this. But at least for me, I've sort of become like more and more convinced that the way that I'll do it well is by not trying to do that. Like maybe there'll be incidences where that's the case and you just meet someone and you can't help it and you really will fight tooth and nail. But at least in terms of where I want to spend my time, I'm happy to make the trade more and more, I think, of like, I don't want to go deep on this thing that everyone else is also going deep on right now. And so that is helpful.
Absolutely. Okay, so what's the next firm?
So the truth is, I don't think I want to do a firm next. I think I want to
Okay.
do something different. I have a couple things that are sort of just entering the mix a little bit, but will take hopefully not 18 months to pull it off, but certainly a few months. So I think I'm going to do a little break from the venture stuff. Who would be your pick?
I was gonna say Thrive. I mean, it's like one that I'd want to write about, and it's one where like I, if I were being honest to them, I'd be like, you should actually just have Mario write this. Like, I would be fun to write.
You
but
would nail it.
him write it. That seems like, in terms of doing things a little bit differently. I mean, Colossus just did a great profile on Neil. I'd love to go even deeper on what Greeno as well.
That was one that I'd had sort of soft circled in my brain for a while. I had a lot of jealousy on that one. I was like,
oh, me too. Fuck. Yeah, that was very good.
God damn.
Those would be the two. I don't think that there's any crazy contrarian thing here. I thought your Hummingbird was excellent in that it was under the radar and you like really brought it above the radar. Have you heard from them at all? Whether that's if LP demand increased as a result of that piece?
I don't know if I've specifically heard about like LP demand, but certainly sort of like interest from founders, general presence in the market, and sort of sense of its own excellence, I think was like, yeah, greatly enhanced by it. And really, I'm glad in that respect because I just think they are like really, really good at what they do. And I've actually enjoyed working with them this year as a venture partner. But yeah, I think it does make a difference. Thrive would be a very good one. I do like that idea. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Then I have my three closing questions. We've gone through all the hard parts.
Lovely.
If someone has now read how many words did it end up being? 35, 40?
35. Yeah.
So if someone has read 35,000 words of yours, what's the best essay that they should read next of yours?
I really like the AI and the Burden of Knowledge essay that I wrote, which is much shorter. So if you want a change of pace, that will not take up a week of your time to read.
A little amuse-bouche. Mm-hmm. What's one essay written by someone else? And you are widely read. Your references are very different than other people in tech. But what's one essay written by somebody else that you think everybody should read?
Can I be honest and say that I'm not a huge fan of essays in general? I'm more of a story person. And
okay, give us a story.
You can have long form stories that obviously are journalistic, but I think the best, I'll give a few because that's always nice to be able to recommend a few things. But essay wise, I think Martin Amis has a really, really good essay on Nabokov, who he really admired as a writer. And I love both of their writing hugely. And so to hear one of them sort of talk about the other is like extremely fascinating. And it's actually like a very uncomfortable essay in many ways because he's talking about how often the themes from Lolita, which people will no doubt know, appear in Nabokov's other writing and what that maybe says about him as a writer. And it's it sort of recasts what you think of him as a writer. It's very wonderfully observed. It sort of reminds you of some of the most beautiful parts of all of his canon. And Amos just, had a extremely, just an unbelievable ability to turn a sentence on its head and make it do a backflip and all these things that are truly incredible. So in the pure essay camp, I'd point to that one. In the long form storytelling nonfiction camp, I would point to any of the work that the Atavist does. I think they do one piece a month. And it's almost always fantastically good. And there are things about, there's one called Half Safe, which is about this one guy's crazy mission to circumnavigate the globe in an amphibious car. That one is extremely fun. And so maybe those would be the two that I would say that somewhat fit the bill.
I have not read either. So these are fantastic recommendations. And then even easier, or maybe harder, last question. If you could implant a one sentence takeaway from the Founders Fund series in someone's brain, what would that one sentence be?
The sentiment would be that I think more people should give themselves the permission to follow a thought to its furthest conclusion, even if it leads somewhere really uncomfortable. Because I think we are given lots of reasons in our life not to do that, and sort of are criticized for doing that if we reveal we do that, or any of these sorts of things. And I think allowing yourself mental transgression is a path to some kind of freedom. So I would say that they're a good embodiment of that.
Man, this was so much fun to read. Even more fun to get a chance to catch up for 90 minutes and talk about it with you. Mario, thank you for doing this.
It was my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me, man.